Andrew McColl here from FamilyVoice, running our Zoom session today, which is entitled The Premier and the Parliament. And our special guest today is Dr. Scott Prasser. Scott has worked in federal and state governments in senior policy and research positions. Most recently, between 2013 and 2019, until his retirement, Scott was senior advisor to 3 federal cabinet ministers covering areas of education, regional development and health. Scott worked as a public servant in Coalition, National Party and Labor Party administrations. As an academic, he worked in 5 universities across 4 states and territories, the last at professorial level, teaching in politics and public policy. He's the father of 3 adult sons. Good afternoon, Scott.
Good afternoon.
Scott, you've witnessed plenty of political manoeuvres, both in Queensland and in the federal parliament. What was the political situation that led to the Queensland Premier moving a motion to gag the parliamentary debate last December on the subject of abortion?
Well, everything is driven by politics. So this was a result really of what happened in the election campaign. And as you know, the LNP government, LNP opposition adopted a low target strategy in that election campaign.
Right.
And it was raised in the election campaign by the Katter people, the Katter Party people, about maybe the very liberal abortion laws that have been brought in by the Labor administration might be up for negotiation or change if they had the balance of power. Now, the LNP concerned about the vote, especially in the Brisbane area, where the LNP does not have a very big presence, sought to hose that down. And to stop it being an issue, once they won government, they've passed this series of resolutions. There'll be no debate on this issue. So this is all about keeping that issue off the agenda, what I call non-decision making. You remove it from the agenda, we don't discuss it, right? So we can't have any debate or any discussion. So it's basically to make the Katter Australia Party irrelevant on the side. They don't have the balance of power, and therefore to stop it being brought up in any sort of way. So it's all about politics, if you like, about sandbagging this issue, pardon the pun given the Queensland floods, keeping this issue off the agenda, okay? That's what it's about.
So was this parliamentary gag that the Premier introduced even constitutional?
Well, we don't have a written constitution in Queensland in the same sense that we have the Commonwealth, and this is a parliamentary issue. So Parliament decides these issues themselves. So even at the Commonwealth level, Commonwealth Parliament can pass resolutions. Now in Queensland, as you know, we're the only state without an upper house. And that means when you win the government, you win everything completely. You're in total control. There's no checks and balances. So you've got the numbers in the Parliament. That's why you're the government. And therefore, you've passed the resolution, which he moved in December. There'll be no debate. There'll be no motions. The Speaker will rule out any discussions. That's been passed by Parliament. The opposition opposed it, but for quite different reasons from what we want to have discussed. And therefore, this will not be debated. And only Parliament can overrule that decision. No court can make any intervention on this matter. Parliament is in control of its own agenda.
Okay. Rob Norman, who is the Queensland Director of ACL, Australian Christian Lobby, wrote after that the Premier's motion undermines our democracy and represents a dangerous precedent of gagging debate on topics the government of the day is uncomfortable with. This reckless gag motion prevents MPs raising concerns about abortion laws for the next term of Parliament. Robbie Katter's plans to reintroduce his live births bill have effectively been blocked for 4 years, leaving our most vulnerable citizens, babies born alive after abortions, without legislative protections. This motion is an outrageous abuse of the parliamentary process. Is Rob Norman right?
He is absolutely correct. This is unprecedented. Now, we do know that governments, when they're in power, will sometimes gag debate during a debate. They try to, look, we don't have any more discussion. We're going to gag the debate. We're going to move the motion. But I can't find where a government has completely ruled out any discussion. You can't even ask a question on this matter in Parliament. And whether you're in favour of more abortion or less abortion, that's really not the issue here. The issue here is that Parliament is a place where members of Parliament are supposed to be able to raise any issue. That's why we have parliamentary privilege. You can get up and say anything you want about anyone and not be sued. So we've really closed down the debate. And as long as this resolution stays, there will be no debate or discussion about abortion in Parliament for 4 years. Now, I think that's a disgrace. But if you think that abortion's gone too far, you should be able to raise issues about it. If you think it's gone not far enough, you should be able to raise issues about it. Parliament, the word parliament means debate, by the way, to parley, to discuss, to negotiate. Now, in the Commonwealth level, this would have to get fought over in the Senate, where the government doesn't have a majority. So you'd have to fight it out with the 18 or 20 crossbench people, and that would be making a much more interesting game. So the ACL is quite right to say this is really an attack on democracy. Also, it indicates that the LNP is afraid to have a discussion and to make a clear policy stand. If they're happy with the existing laws, okay, they can say that in Parliament and debate that in Parliament, and they should not be afraid to attack the Katter Party or whatever view they want to take and say, we're going to stand by these existing arrangements, despite though maybe some of our supporters don't agree with it. So it's a really gutless act on the Christopher's government's part to close down the debate in this way.
Good. Just for the sake of our listeners who may have a question to put to Dr. Prasser, when we've finished most of our questions this afternoon, we'll be throwing it open to you viewers. If you have a question to put to Dr. Prasser through our moderator, who is in this case my colleague in WA, Daryl Budge, if you want to just send that off to him while we're engaging in these questions, and Daryl will gather those and put them to Dr. Prasser when my main bulk of questions are finished with. So if this gag, Scott, was to go unchallenged, would it mean that a Premier, if faced with a public matter that they didn't want exposed, could simply ask the Parliament to gag debate on the subject?
That's correct. So this is a very dangerous precedent. I don't recall the Bajolki-Peterson government, which everyone is very happy to attack all the time about its undemocratic rules, which I don't quite agree with. That means if something else comes up, say we come to debate the Olympic Games, where we're going to put the stadium. Now, just say the government passes a resolution, there'll be no further debate, whether it will be at Victoria Park or somewhere else and so on. This is a very dangerous precedent. And this is the problem when you have a unicameral single parliament system going on. Now, what the opposition or what the Katter Party could do, or an independent could do, is try to move a resolution and have it ruled out of order by the Speaker, and make that move every week. Every week as Parliament sitting, move the motion and highlight how this is preventing proper discussion on this issue. That's what I would do. If I was in the camp wanting to debate the issue, I would move it every session, every week, and make the government front up and say, and then I would challenge the Premier or the Attorney General to a public debate outside of Parliament every week. So, Mr. Premier, Mr. Attorney General, I want to debate the issue about the laws at a public forum outside of Parliament. I'll see you there. That's what you want to do. If you want to play politics, that's what you got to do. You got to play the politics back the hard way to embarrass them. At the moment, the media are not making much attention to this, mainly because the media probably thinks the abortion laws are fine. Again, that's not the issue. The issue is, can we have a debate and discussion about a potentially controversial matter? And the answer is yes.
I'd have thought that one purpose of the Parliament was to be a forum for open and public debate on any matter, and that the Premier would clearly understand that. Was I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. But again, as I keep pointing out to people, since I've spent a lot of my life working for politicians, everything's done for politics, okay? And occasionally we get good politics and good policy. This is done so. Let's remember the last election, the recent election, the LNP did not win one new seat in Brisbane. Now think about it. They did not win one new seat in Brisbane. Seats that were once Liberal seats, seat of Ashgrove, once was a Liberal seat, seat of Aspley, once was a Liberal seat, they remain in the Labor camp. And Labor, of course, wanted to provoke all this so that because their inner city voters probably are more in favour of the existing Liberal abortion laws. So the Liberal Party made, I think, the misjudgment, oh, well, there's no votes here for us, therefore we're not going to get on this bandwagon of having a debate. They could have got on the bandwagon and had a debate and showed that they were willing for democratic principles, and that would have got some support even from the inner city people who bang on a lot about democracy. So it's pretty incredible that in this day and age of social media and all the other stuff which is available, and pornography which is available, that we can't have a debate about a law passed by Queensland Parliament because the new government doesn't want to be embarrassed by it.
So really you're saying that this was the triumph of politics over ethics?
Well, it's definitely, everything's a triumph of politics, by the way. I'm sorry to disappoint everyone, but it's the case, okay? I've been at meetings of federal, state education ministers where the poor federal minister whom I work for put up a very reasonable idea. When the meeting was in camera, that is not public, everyone agreed. And then as soon as the meeting is over, the state ministers go out and do a press conference and attack the federal minister. So there's not much logic going on in lots of the debates and discussions. You've got to just look things through the prism of politics. And by politics, I mean partisan politics. Anything to embarrass the other mob is what goes on. And that's why it's very hard often to get good discussion, because everyone jumps into their corner and comes out boxing with their partisan viewpoint all the time. So I think it would have been good, given that the LNP were very critical of Labor administrations for 10 years about the lack of public debate on issues, secrecy, cabinet decisions, shonky figures being put up about Olympic Games stadiums. I would have thought a breath of fresh air or a fresh start, as all their press releases run with, would have been, we're going to have a debate, we're going to allow a debate about this issue. And they would have had the numbers to knock any change, if that's what they wanted. The ALP would have argued that there should have been more liberal laws. That's fine. We're all grown up. We're going to cope with that. But by closing it down is really the weakest possible response.
Do you think this is yet another reason why Queenslanders should press for the creation of an upper house to prevent politicians dodging public scrutiny?
Well, look, an upper house is not a magic solution. You can look at upper houses in other states. They do act as some review. The best upper house is the Senate. Just remember, our Senate is the only elected upper house, national upper house, in all Westminster systems. All other Westminster systems have appointed upper houses. The Canadian Senate is appointed. The British House of Lords is appointed. New Zealand got rid of their upper house in 1951. And we should have an upper house, but to create an upper house would require such political capital that no government will ever do it. Because as soon as you talk about it, everyone's going to jump. That's going to mean more politicians, and we will never get past that debate. The democracy debate will come second in that race.
Right. Well, it isn't hard to have an upper house in Queensland with the same number of politicians. If you just take out 30 and said, well, look, we can run with 60 in the lower house, 30 in the upper house, and so there are no more politicians. They're just in two different houses.
That's right. Look, Colin Hughes in the book that we talked about had quite a good chapter on that. The trouble is, which of the 30 are going to go and move themselves to the upper house and maybe lose their careers? Volunteers, please step forward. Okay, so that's the problem. No one wants to do it, in a sense. I think an upper house, I mean, I like the Senate. My job working for those three ministers you mentioned was to negotiate with the crossbench and the Labor Party. And I'm very proud that on one bit of major legislation, I got everyone on board. I got the Greens, I got the crossbench, I got the ALP to support industrial chemicals legislation, right? But it's not easy. And the reason why governments don't like upper houses because it's harder. It requires more work, right? When you've got a majority like we have in Queensland, the government can basically, unless there's a party revolt, the backbench revolts, and that won't happen, especially under the Labor Party. Therefore, the government's got the numbers and they can basically do what they want. It's really a sort of democratic dictatorship in a sense. And the electorate seems amazingly disinterested. Just remember, we don't teach state politics at the University of Queensland anymore. We don't teach state politics at Griffith University anymore. We don't teach politics very much at QUT. We don't have an ABC program every 7:30 night looking at state politics. We have a national ABC TV program, which only runs 4 nights a week. So we don't have much emphasis in looking at what our state governments are doing. That's one of the problems we've got. And a lot of people don't understand the importance of state governments. The COVID, when state governments closed borders and had all those powers to lock down, people realised, oh my goodness, state governments are important. Well, they certainly are, but we don't study them. We don't study them in Australia at all.
So part of the problem there is actually the voters themselves. I guess that's what you're saying.
Yes, it is. And I don't want to blame the poor voter who doesn't know who to believe sometimes because he hears such contrary views being expressed, often opposite to each other. But it's very interesting. If you listen to the current affairs shows or the radio shows, what I find interesting these days is the number of times journalists interview journalists, right? ABC journalists will interview an ABC journalist somewhere else. We don't have them talking. Back in the 80s and 90s, a lot of academics did a lot of work on talking about state government and the state of Queensland government. And that did help raise awareness of what's going on. And the parliamentary system looks, from the outside, it looks odd. All those motions and people yelling at each other and so on. I don't think people really get how it works and makes it understandable. So what do most people do? They basically turn off. That's what happens. most people are not that interested in politics as such, and I don't blame them for that. But one of the roles of academics and one of the roles of Parliament itself is to educate people and to inform them what's going on. And that's why we should have had a debate on this issue so people can hear both sides. And Mr. Christofouli wants to get up and say any debate on this issue upsets young women. Well, okay, you can get up and say that. I will say, prove it. Prove it. Where's your evidence on this matter? And does that mean we're not going to debate any issues that might upset people? We won't discuss car accidents, drugs, robberies, assaults. That might upset people. So that's not a very good way to discuss things in a democracy. We've got to have robust discussion, and we've got to hear things sometimes we may not want to hear.
True. So if us Queenslanders don't approve of this gag motion, what can we do about it? And what should we do about it?
Well, groups like ACL are really important in presenting and getting that information out. Contact your local member, okay? Contact your local member. And let me tell you, having worked for a backbencher and worked for members, if enough complaints come in, someone somewhere is saying, we're going to have to look at this. If everyone remains silent, silence means consent. That is, we must all agree with it. But if we say some complaint about this matter, then someone is going to say, well, maybe David Christofouli, maybe we shouldn't have the gag. I've had 400 complaints this week or something like that. That's what you're going to do. It's the old story in politics. The squeaky gate gets the oil. If there's no squeak, there won't be any oil. Okay, so we've got to start squeaking so this information, this view, this concern gets there. And it's not just about votes, as you say. It's about ethics. It's about morality. We should be having open debate, and this is a rather important issue about abortion. It's interesting. We seem to be very interested in the killing people off with euthanasia and abortion, but then we're worried about the death rate from car accidents or floods. Okay, we go into hyperactivity over these things. So it requires organisations to speak up and step up to these matters.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to ask Daryl at this point. Daryl, do you have any questions coming in from our viewers that they'd like to put to Dr. Prasser on this matter?
Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Prasser. Joe asks, how can we get people, especially Christians, more interested in politics?
Well, look, everyone should be interested in politics because it's the way we're governed. I don't think churches should become get directly involved in politics. You should be able to go to church and not be barraged with a particular point of view or whatever. However, Christians have a duty to speak up about what they feel is a concern. And the reason why things have gone so much against Christians in a way is because too many of us have not been willing to say, no, that's really a bad idea. So churches can say, don't have to take a stand on an issue unless it's very much within the church biblical practice, should say, you should get involved in politics. Whether you join a party or watch what's going on, you should be informed. Churches could also run current events things so people understand just what is Parliament, what is the Constitution. I mean, how many people in Australia know what the Commonwealth Constitution is, right? I bet very few people do. Civics education is very poor in Australia for all sorts of reasons. And so I think what churches can do is to try and develop some neutral areas where people can get the basics about how the system works. Because I don't think people understand the basics. I've been in a lot of meetings giving talks to people. A lot of people don't know how the voting system works. They don't know which level of government is responsible for what, which is understandable. And there's ways to find out about those things. So churches could do things like that. They haven't got to get into the fray of the battle, which would alienate some of their members, but they can get into the game of saying, we ought to be informed about what's going on. We ought to know how things work. And it's up to you as an individual Christian whether you want to take further action. That's my view on these matters.
Yeah, excellent. Totally with you. We've just had a WA election just the other weekend, and it involved outsourcing of the WA Electoral Commission's activities to an external provider. Now, that's opened up a bunch of questions about the legitimacy of the actions and the way voters were advised. And it did. I did note that a lot of the staffers and other people have reported me that the staff were trained to say to voters, just number one box above the line in the upper house, or up to 20, at least 20 below the line. And the low information and low quality of content that went to each of the voters, therefore meant that a lot of them just voted one above the line. And I think a lot of those then exhausted. And then we got this particular upper house that we ended up with, where very little votes flowed to any of the other minor parties. And they're basically exhausted in staying siloed in one of the smaller parties. So what do you think that tells us, one, about the information that voters have, but also that even the process of a government outsourcing its election activities? And I've called for a Royal Commission, or at the very least, we should have a parliamentary inquiry into the process why our democracy is getting outsourced to some private company who happen to also donate to the Labor Party to the tune of millions and millions of dollars. What do you think about those matters?
Well, that's a matter of concern. And of course, there should have been much more discussion within Parliament itself. The government got the numbers overwhelmingly there about if you're going to give directions to people, then it's got to have these elements of it. Okay, that element is correct, but it's sort of, as you said, it's giving it leads to a very biased result, which isn't a result the government wants, by the way. So it's a very dangerous practice we're going down. And having a government with that sort of majority is also pretty tricky and dangerous in where we're going with those sort of issues. So, look, it's a matter of whether, and unfortunately, the universities, the academics are almost silent on these matters. Okay, I don't recall too many academics from University of Queensland complaining about the closing down of the abortion debate. But had it been something else under a National Party government, then there would have been a hue and cry about something. Okay, so because the academics are overwhelming left of centre, you have to accept that's the story, right? The big mistake in my life was becoming an academic because I thought it was about rational debate. So we're not really getting, there are some good people at University of Queensland, especially in the law faculty, is where you're going to find them, but where you can have those discussions. So there needs to be more independent analysis from informed people. Explain, my view, the role of the academic is to explain to the general public how things actually work in a truthful way. Okay, that's what I think an academic's role should. Unfortunately, all the brownie points in academia is about writing in journals that no one reads. So that's the game going on. Okay, Western Australia, a dangerous situation happening, and outsourcing of our democratic practices seems pretty crazy to me.
It's possible that the Australian Electoral Commission may do the same. I mean, Michaeli Cash has just asked questions of the AEC. Can you please tell us whether or not you've done similar kind of contracting, and have you used this particular group before themselves? So we had, really long lines, people not being able to obtain a ballot. In some cases, even people were writing a paper ballot with their own writing because there was no more ballot papers left in certain regions. Other places in very remote country areas, whole busloads would be turning up at the polling booth, and they'll be asked for their driver's license. If they couldn't give it, then they were turned away. Just extraordinary levels of misinformation or even disinformation that is being allowed because of the bureaucracy that's been created. And I think even just looking at our national debt levels, we can see we're about to hit a national $1 trillion national debt. What would you say in terms of the public, what should it be calling for to demand of the government to do? Because one of the things I'm concerned about is the level of deep state bureaucracy, that bureaucracy just never changes hands, and we don't actually have a say on what happens with it. And they can define terms and change terms and make appointments and stuff like that. And the government and the good people we have in government is scrambling to ask questions in Senate estimates or in budget estimates, and they're just trying to work out what these bureaucracy actually doing with all the money we're giving them. So what do you think we should do about that growing bureaucracy level?
Well, the problem in Australia is that the public service, of which I was a public servant, has become politicised, right? That is, once upon a time, the public service was permanent. By permanent, I mean people joined, worked their way up the career path, and they were there basically unless they did something dramatically wrong, okay? Now, and the idea was the public service was whoever got in the government, they would carry out the instructions of the government of the day. Okay, that's great. Now, what's happened over the last 3 or 4 decades in Australia, we've gone down the American route. That is, so new governments come in, they therefore have made all senior public servants are on contract, right? And that goes down quite a few levels. Now, if you're on contract, you're going to give the government what it wants, not what it needs, right? Back in the Joe days, why hasn't Queensland got a state bank? I'll tell you why Queensland hasn't got a state bank, because the head of Treasury, Leo Ilcher, said it was a stupid idea, right? And that's why we haven't got one. Thank goodness we haven't got a state bank. That's why we don't have a state zoo as well, okay? You had a permanent public service who could say no to the minister of the day or say, that's a really dumb idea, minister. These days, all the people who are being appointed at the top level are increasingly people with connections, and they're appointed on contract, right? So this means they are either sympathisers with the government, supporters of the government. They might be competent, but they're what I call merit cronies, okay? So that means we've lost that independence from the public service. And that's why we've had a shambles. 3.5 years and we haven't resolved the Olympic Games issues. 3.5 years. Now think about it. We won the prize. Now it's a prize no one else wanted, by the way. We've got the prize. And with 3.5 years, we are still not sure of what we're going to build. Now, there will shortly be a decision. Thank goodness, we hope. Now, where was the public service? Where was Treasury in through all this? Where were the people in? Why did the previous government set up such a lousy series of processes about this sort of thing? That's the example I'm talking about. So what we've got is a politicised public service. What I want is something like, in America, they've got a politicised public service, but they have a thing in their constitution called the Senate confirmation process. So when government appoints senior people to the bureaucracy or members to the Supreme Court, they've got to front up to a Senate committee and get confirmed. Now, what that does, it makes government of the day a bit careful who they appoint. Most of them get appointed, but they often make sure the person they're suggesting is not a drunk or a wife basher or whatever, okay? Now, we don't have that in Australia. We really have a process that more and more public servants have got connections, political connections to the government of the day. Now, this really started with the Whitlam government. Whitlam government appointed 3 people who are on his personal staff to be permanent, to be department secretaries, department heads in the Whitlam government, okay? And that sort of started the rot, if you like, and that's occurred with all the changes of governments around at the state level. So that's the problem we've got. So you wonder whether the people being appointed are being appointed on merit or being appointed on their political sympathies with the government of the day. That's the issue. I'm in the merit camp, okay? I want people appointed on merit. That's the only game. Not on gender, not on some quota, but on can you do the job? That's what I want, because we've got a lot of problems. And I think many of the problems we've had in public policy is because the public service has lost its capability. And that's because it's become politicized.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I did find that the Human Rights Commission particularly has become extremely politicised as a body under the Labor governments. And then the most recent appointment was under the Liberal government of the new commissioner. And as a result, the Human Rights Commission has actually written a report that's been quite scathing of the intrusion into human rights. Now, I'm just wondering if you have an opinion on that particular report that's just been handed down, and whether or not, in terms of the human rights level, what is going on in Australia. And I know that there is a big call right now for a Human Rights Act, federally speaking, which I think is going to be turned out to be a fairly dangerous idea. What do you think? What do you?
Well, I haven't read the report, but I'm not in the human. I'm in civil liberties camp, but I'm not in the Human Rights Commission camp. Okay, because what happens? What starts out as a good idea, you know, people should not be discriminated against. Fine. Then it gets resolved by the courts or interpreted by the courts to mean something more than that, right? And that's the danger. We go down those tracks, okay? So it starts off, we want to stop some terrible thing, but we end up, the courts interpret it wider and wider, so employers can't do something or something, and the concept of human rights gets broader and broader and broader, sort of thing. And basically, you know, Australia has done an extraordinarily great job of, given the migration program we've had, given 98% of Australians are from other countries, it's been a pretty good overall thing. Do some people get discriminated? I could make a very good, strong argument, that a person who's a conservative is discriminated against. I could make a pretty strong argument. I can tell you right here and now, in academic land where I've been, if I'd been in the Whitlam Hooray Club, my advancement would have been faster. Okay, so it depends on, discrimination often gets very one-tracked on one side and the other stuff. So I think myself, some of these bodies should have been trimmed down or abolished or whatever. And unfortunately, Liberal governments haven't got the guts to do it. That's basically the problem. Malcolm Fraser gets a blame for not rolling back many of the extensions of government into people's lives that happened under the Whitlam government. That's the problem.
And what are you saying actually happened on the Whitlam government? I know a lot of these things that have happened are very historical. What do you say was what really flipped it?
The Whitlam government came into power, and they had some good. I've done a book on the Whitlam government, there were some things that needed to be done and so on, because time had moved on and so on. But Whitlam government, in my lifetime, government has become more intrusive in our lives than it used to be, right? Okay. And Whitlam government expanded the welfare programs, and we're seeing that in this pre-election period at the moment. Each side of politics is we're in a sort of bargaining game, like it's like a bazaar, you know, like I'll give you this, we'll match you with that. So the Mr. Albanese spends so much on Medibank, Mr. Dutton will match it or give more money on Medibank. Government has got more intrusive in our lives, and it doesn't mean, although people talk about freedom, actually we've lost some of our freedom and all these things. I'm very concerned about anything that controls freedom of speech. Okay, right? I'm very concerned how we go down that track, right? So the present debate going on about freedom of speech, we want to stop some people saying nasty things. My view of the world is you've got to cope with it. I'd rather have the freedom rather than the constriction. Okay, that's it. And that's my view on these matters. So I think the Whitlam government increased spending dramatically. It created the welfare system. Look, my grandfather, I'll give you an example. My grandfather was 85 and we couldn't convince him to get a pension. Okay. He thought the pension was for old people, basically. And he eventually got on the pension, but he didn't really want it. But why? Because he believed in self-sufficiency. Okay, right, okay. And I can tell you something. I sent back the family allowance check. The Prassers don't want it, because I don't want a bureaucrat ringing up my wife saying what she might earn next year. So, okay, we don't want the check. We don't want the money. I want to be independent. Now, unfortunately, that's not a view most Australians have. Today, we're getting to the point where a majority of Australians are on some sort of benefit of some sort. And a lot of people couch their lives in so they can get the benefit, right? Okay. I know a lot of people at my level who quoted me, "Oh, Scott, have your son got this benefit?" No, well, my son didn't really want to apply for the benefit. But that's what we've got. We've created that sort of thing. And once you start taking money from government, it's like schools. Once you start taking money from government, lo and behold, one day government's going to tell you what to do. That's the danger.
Yeah, so the argument is being made in WA Labor government that if we're giving money to schools, then therefore they have the right to dictate what staff can and cannot hire. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I'm in the Christian school camp. We have a very large non-government school sector in Australia, which is growing faster than the government school sector. Has been growing faster than government school sector for years and years, and it's actually accelerated, especially in the Christian group of independent schools. But now I think if you're running a Christian school, you want it to be taught by people who are Christian. If you're running a Muslim school, you want it to be taught to people who have empathy with the Muslim religion, okay? And so on. If you're running a Jewish school, you want it to be, you send your kids there because of the values that that school espouses, right? Therefore, you should be able to make a decision about whom you employ, right? Okay. Similarly, if you're running a political party, you don't appoint people from the Labor Party. If you're a Liberal Party branch, it's just idiotic. So that's where the discrimination laws get caught up. You can see it get caught up in that sort of game, if you like. And because the media are very the media are anti-Christian in a way. Poor old Mr. Morrison, he really copped it, didn't he? Being a Pentecostalist, and even though a lot of people go to private Christian schools or religious schools, they do cop a lot. But you send your kid of choice because you want certain values to be inculcated at that school, and therefore you should expect the school to employ people who have sympathy to that point of view of the school, okay? And if they can't do that, then you're destroying the whole purpose of having a variegated education system, which I think is fantastic. You can have a choice: public school, Catholic school, independent school, and there's a wide variation of independent schools.
That's right. Now, you wrote a book I thought was quite interesting, Restraining Elective Dictatorship. Now, you kind of used the term earlier in our discussion about we have this elective dictatorship. So you've obviously explained how can we restrain that. Now, obviously there's parliamentary things that can be done to restrain it, but how does the ordinary person restrain this elective dictatorship that we have?
Well, it goes back to the issue of activity, being involved in things. We're a country of watchers, not necessarily joiners. Okay, very few people join political parties. Political party membership is in massive decline, right? That's one thing. So you don't join things. We spend more time watching sport than we do watching anything else. Being aware of what's going on. In America, they have a lot of things called public interest groups that monitor what their members of parliament do. And these are really interesting. They can tell you how many times someone voted, what they voted on, how many times they weren't in parliament, all those sort of things. that's a pretty interesting exercise that could happen. We could have more of those. There was an attempt to form one back in 1972, 73 in Queensland. It never lasted very long, trying to monitor what exactly do our parliamentarians do. Okay, look, I was brought up in Townsville, and the local member was a guy called Tom Aitkins. He used to be the ALP member, and he became the North Queensland ALP, right? Or North Queensland. He disassociated himself from ALP. He used to ride around a bicycle, okay, and see people. And he used to come to the Pictures Theatre every Saturday night and give a report about what was happening in Parliament, okay? We all heard that this week in Parliament, this legislation was passed. The Premier said this and that and this and that. And that's something that was very interesting in local democracy, sort of thing. So the trouble with our urban lives, we don't often know who our neighbours are. We don't have a lot of community of interest and things like that. Through schools, we have a bit. Through some clubs, we have a bit. So we're often losing that sort of community feeling of what's happening. But I think we need more public interest groups. One of the good things about the Whitlam government was it triggered off a tremendous amount of interest in politics, right? Because every day the front page of headlines were exciting about the latest crazy idea from the government, and everyone got interested, and it really increased membership of parties, increased interest in looking at what's happening in politics and going on. So and we're seeing this. The growth in the minor parties is an example of people's exasperation with politics, in a sense, except they're not the solution. They're actually another problem in a sense. So that's what we've got to do. There's no magic way about this. But I am in favour, as you know, of an upper house. I am in favour of democracy. I am in favour of open debate and discussions. And I think we should have. I also think that some of the people in politics don't play it cleverly enough. As I said, if you're really concerned about abortion, then okay, challenge the Premier for a debate outside of Parliament, or have a debate without the Premier, with an empty cardboard cutout there or something. And with social media now, you can bypass the organised media a bit and get your views out there a bit. Okay.
Yeah, that is true. I think I've pretty wrapped up my questions for today, Andrew. It's been a great discussion with you, Dr. Prasser. There's really interesting topics we've got to cover today. Sorry, you're still on mute, Andrew. There we go.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Scott, for being a part of our discussion. You've made some significant contributions to our understanding today about Queensland government and what we can do in future to make things better. So thank you for your role today.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
All the best. Bye-bye.